The morning sun of June 4th, 1942 cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier task force approached what would become the graveyard of Japanese naval supremacy, the four aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and here you cut through the azure waters with the confidence of an empire that had never known defeat at sea. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the formation. For 6 months, his carrier force had been the terror of the Pacific, striking Pearl Harbor with devastating precision and sweeping through the Dutch East Indies. Like a steel typhoon, the Americans, he believed, were broken scattered remnants of a once proud fleet hiding in their distant harbors, but 300 miles to the northeast. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance was preparing to shatter that illusion forever. The American admiral, thrust into command after Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey's hospitalization, possessed something the Japanese had fatally underestimated: complete knowledge of their plans. Unknown to Nagumo, American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher JN-25, revealing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's entire battle plan. The trap was set, and the hunters had become the hunted. The first Japanese strike launched at dawn, 108 aircraft roaring off the carrier decks toward Midway atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation, his level bombers and dive bombers escorted by protective Zeros as they disappeared into the morning haze. Nagumo felt the familiar surge of confidence that had carried him through countless victories. On Midway itself, Marine defenders scrambled to meet the incoming threat. Major Floyd Parks led his fighter squadron into the air, knowing they faced overwhelming odds. The obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and handful of Wildcats were no match for the veteran Japanese pilots, but they would sell their lives dearly. The attack on Midway was fierce but inconclusive. Tomonaga's bombers hammered the installations, but the airfield remained operational. As the strike force began its return journey, Tomonaga radioed the fatal message that would doom the Japanese fleet: there is need for a second attack. This single transmission triggered a cascade of decisions that would seal Japan's fate. Nagumo, believing the American fleet was still hundreds of miles away, ordered his reserve strike force to be rearmed for a second attack on Midway. Torpedoes designed to sink ships were removed from the aircraft and replaced with bombs meant for land targets. But as the armament crews worked frantically in the hangar decks, reconnaissance pilot Petty Officer First Class Amari Tone launched from the cruiser Tone, 30 minutes behind schedule due to a faulty catapult. The seemingly minor delay would prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled desperately above empty ocean, his Enterprise dive bombers running low on fuel. The American strike had missed the Japanese fleet's calculated position, and McCluskey faced the agonizing decision of whether to continue the search or return to his carrier. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles, where split-second decisions and cruel fate would determine the course of World War II in the Pacific. Neither side yet realized that the next few hours would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the world's largest ocean, transforming the seemingly invincible Japanese combined fleet into a burning symbol of imperial overreach. At 07:28 hours, Petty Officer Amari Tone's voice crackled over the radio. Forever changing the course of naval history, have sighted 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The message hit the Akagi's ridge like a thunderbolt. Admiral Nagumo's face went ashen as he absorbed the implications. The American fleet wasn't cowering in Pearl Harbor, it was here, dangerously close, and his own ships were caught in the worst possible position. Below decks, organized chaos erupted as Japanese crews scrambled to reverse the rearming process. The hangar decks of all four carriers became scenes of frantic activity, as torpedoes were hastily wheeled back to replace the land attack bombs. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the deck, and ammunition was stacked in precarious piles of powder. KEG waiting for a spark. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, meanwhile, had made the decision that would save the American fleet. Following his instincts in a lone Japanese destroyer's wake, he led his 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers toward their destiny. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey's voice rang out over the radio. Attack! Attack! The attack began with what seemed like American disaster. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese fleet first. The obsolete Douglas Devastators, flying low and slow, were sitting ducks for the Japanese combat air patrol. Lieutenant George Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates were shot down one by one. Of 15 aircraft, only Gay survived, floating in the water as a witness to the battle's climax. But the torpedo attacks, though costly failures, served a crucial purpose. They drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. When McCluskey's dive bombers appeared overhead at 10:24 hours, the Japanese carriers were completely vulnerable. The first American dive bombers screamed down toward the Kaga. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown simultaneously targeted the Soryu. The Japanese carriers, caught with their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, became floating infernos within minutes. According to historical accounts documented in the Battle of Midway by Craig Simmons, the transformation was instantaneous and devastating. The Kaga absorbed for direct hits, her flight deck erupting in a chain reaction of explosions that engulfed the entire ship. The Soryu, struck by 3 bombs, became a blazing wreck that would sink within hours. But it was the fate of the Akagi that truly symbolized the collapse of Japanese naval power. At 10:26 hours, Lieutenant Richard Best's bomb punched through the flagship's flight deck, just behind the amidships elevator. The explosion detonated the armed aircraft waiting for takeoff, creating a hellish scene of fire and destruction. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, was forced to abandon his flagship. As he transferred to the cruiser Nagara, he witnessed the destruction of everything he had built. The pride of the Japanese carrier fleet lay burning and dying, their trained aircrew irreplaceable veterans of countless battles perishing in the flames. The Hiryu, separated from the main force, remained untouched and immediately launched a counterattack. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers toward the American fleet, determined to extract revenge for the morning's catastrophe. The Japanese strike found the USS Yorktown, scoring several hits that left the carrier dead in the water. But one operational carrier could not reverse the day's disaster. The Americans had shattered the backbone of Japanese naval aviation in less than 5 minutes, destroying not just ships, but the irreplaceable pilots and crew who had made them so deadly. As the sun reached its zenith over the Pacific, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese command structure, built on the foundation of carrier superiority, began to crumble under the weight of unprecedented defeat. The smoke from the burning carriers created a pall that seemed to darken the very soul of the Japanese fleet. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, now aboard the cruiser Nagara, watched his life's work reduced to funeral pyres on the Pacific horizon. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor sat in stunned silence, his normally decisive mind struggling to process the magnitude of the catastrophe. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu embodied the honor and tragedy of the moment. When ordered to abandon his burning ship, he refused, choosing instead to go down with his command. His final act was to face the Imperial Palace and sing the national anthem as his carrier slipped beneath the waves at 7:13 p.m. The loss of such experienced commanders would prove as devastating as the loss of the ships themselves. The Hiryu, under Captain Tomio Kaku, remained the last functioning carrier in Nagumo's force. Determined to salvage something from the disaster, he launched a second strike against the American fleet. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto led 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters in a desperate assault on the USS Yorktown, already damaged from the morning attack. The strike succeeded in delivering what appeared to be a death blow to the American carrier. The Yorktown, hit by 2 torpedoes, began listing heavily to port. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship, and the crew reluctantly left their vessel floating dead in the water. For a brief moment, Japanese spirits lifted. They had drawn American blood. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, had already demonstrated the flexible thinking that would characterize American naval strategy. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, bound by rigid doctrine and face-saving protocols, Nimitz adapted quickly to changing circumstances. The American response was swift and decisive. The Enterprise and Hornet, still operational, launched a massive strike against the Hiryu at 5 p.m. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers in the attack that would complete the destruction of Nagumo's force. The Hiryu, struck by 4 bombs, became the 4th and final carrier to die that day. Captain Kaku, following the example of his fellow commanders, chose to go down with his ship. Before the Hiryu sank, he and Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the carrier division commander, held a final ceremony on the bridge. They burned the battle flag, shared a final cup of sake, and sang the national anthem as their ship joined its sisters on the ocean floor. The psychological impact on the Japanese command structure was immediate and profound. These were not just ships being lost, they were symbols of Japanese invincibility, crewed by veterans who had trained for decades to perfect their craft. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced pilots created a void that Japan's industrial capacity could never fill. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, received the devastating reports with growing alarm. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his gamble had failed catastrophically. The American fleet, which he had hoped to lure into a decisive battle, had instead delivered a crushing defeat to his most valuable assets. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate battle. Japanese naval aviation had lost not just carriers but the institutional knowledge that made them effective. The dead pilots floating in the Pacific represented decades of training and combat experience that could never be recovered. Flight instructors, squadron leaders, and veteran aircrew, the backbone of Japanese naval power, were gone forever. As night fell on June 4th, the Japanese fleet began its retreat. But this was not the organized withdrawal of a force preserving its strength for future battles. This was the disorganized flight of a broken command structure, its confidence shattered and its strategic vision in ruins. The sun that had risen on Japanese naval supremacy now set on the beginning of their long decline. The psychological wounds inflicted at Midway would prove as lasting as the material losses, forever changing how Japanese commanders approached naval warfare. The morning of June 5, 1942 dawned with the Japanese fleet in full retreat, but Admiral Yamamoto was not ready to accept defeat. From his flagship Yamato, the architect of Pearl Harbor contemplated one final gamble that would either salvage victory from disaster or complete the destruction of his naval forces. The submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been lurking in the waters near Midway since the battle began. As the damaged USS Yorktown limped away under tow, escorted by the destroyer USS Hammond, Tanabe saw his opportunity to strike a blow for the Emperor. At 3:36 p.m., the submarine's torpedoes found their mark. The Yorktown, already mortally wounded, took 2 more hits that sealed her fate. The destroyer Hammond, tied alongside providing power and pumping services, was broken in half by a torpedo that detonated her depth charges. The explosion was so violent that it killed or wounded most of her crew within seconds. Captain Buckmaster, who had returned to his ship to supervise salvage operations, watched helplessly as his carrier began her final death throes. The Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea and now Midway, rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, taking with her the hopes of the Japanese that they had achieved some measure of revenge. But this tactical success could not mask the strategic catastrophe that was already reshaping the Pacific War. The loss of the 4 carriers represented more than just ships. It was the destruction of Japan's ability to project power. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, the domino effect was already beginning. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commanding the invasion force approaching Midway, received the order to withdraw with growing concern. The carefully planned assault on the atoll, designed to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle, had instead become a costly failure. The transport ships, loaded with 2,500 troops, turned back toward Japan without firing a shot. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was immediate and devastating. Admiral Yamamoto, who had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year, now saw his prediction coming true ahead of schedule. The window of opportunity was closing, and with it, Japan's chances of achieving a negotiated peace. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the defeat in his palace, struggled to understand how his invincible navy had suffered such a catastrophic loss. The careful fiction of Japanese superiority, maintained through controlled information and propaganda, began to crumble under the weight of reality. The American response was swift and decisive. Admiral Nimitz, recognizing the significance of the victory, immediately began planning offensive operations that would have been impossible just days earlier. The initiative in the Pacific had passed to the United States, and American commanders were not slow to capitalize on their advantage. The industrial implications of the defeat were equally profound. Japan's shipyards, already straining to meet the demands of global warfare, faced the impossible task of replacing not just the carriers, but the trained personnel who had made them effective. The Akagi and Kaga had been converted from battleships in the 1920s, representing decades of development and refinement. The Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built fleet carriers, embodying the latest in naval aviation technology. But more critically, the pilots who had died in the flames could not be replaced. Japanese pilot training programs, designed for quality over quantity, took years to produce competent aviators. The Americans, with their vast industrial capacity and pragmatic approach to training, could replace their losses within months. Japan could not. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, was now a defensive force struggling to protect an overextended empire. The long retreat that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War had begun, though few on either side yet realized the full implications of what had transpired in the waters off Midway. As the surviving Japanese ships limped back toward home ports, their commanders faced the grim task of explaining to their superiors how the mightiest naval force in the world had been humbled by an enemy they had dismissed as broken and demoralized. The return to Japanese home waters was a journey through shame and disbelief. As the remnants of the mobile force entered Core Naval Base on June 13th, the sight that greeted them was one of barely contained panic. The Naval High Command, which had grown accustomed to reports of glorious victories, now faced the impossible task of explaining how their most elite force had been annihilated. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, called an emergency meeting that would expose the fault lines running through the Japanese command structure. The conference room in the Navy Ministry building became a theater of recrimination and desperate planning as senior officers struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. The human cost was staggering and irreplaceable. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga, Commander Takashi Jigusa, Japan's most experienced dive bomber leader, and scores of other veteran officers had perished in the flames. These were not just casualties of war, but the institutional memory of Japanese naval aviation accumulated through decades of training and combat experience. The cover-up began immediately. Surviving aircrew were quarantined upon their return, forbidden from discussing the battle with family or friends. The Japanese public, fed a steady diet of victory reports, was told that the American fleet had been dealt a severe blow at Midway. The truth of the disaster was classified at the highest levels, creating a dangerous disconnect between reality and planning. But the effects could not be hidden from those who mattered most. In the shipyards of Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka, naval architects and engineers worked frantically to accelerate carrier construction programs. The Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku represented Japan's hopes for rebuilding their carrier force. But these ships were years away from completion. The pilot shortage was even more critical. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, found himself tasked with an impossible mission: rebuilding Japanese naval aviation from the ashes of Midway. The training programs that had produced such skilled pilots were designed for peacetime development, not wartime replacement. Japan simply lacked the resources and time to train new pilots at the rate they were being lost. American intelligence, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the full scope of their victory. Radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations revealed that the Japanese had lost not just for carriers, but the core of their naval aviation capability. Admiral Nimitz, ever pragmatic, immediately began planning the offensive operations that would exploit this advantage. The strategic implications rippled throughout the Japanese Empire. In the Solomon Islands, Japanese forces preparing for the invasion of Port Moresby found themselves without the naval air support that had been promised. The carefully coordinated advance that was supposed to bring Australia within range of Japanese bombers began to stall as resources were diverted to defending existing positions. General Hideki Tojo, serving as both Prime Minister and War Minister, faced the impossible task of maintaining offensive operations across multiple fronts. With diminished naval support, the Army, which had always viewed the Navy with suspicion, now questioned whether their rivals could fulfill their strategic promises. The psychological impact on Japanese military culture was profound and lasting. The concept of inevitable victory, which had sustained Japanese forces through the early months of the war, began to crack under the weight of reality. For the first time since the Russo-Japanese War, Japanese military leaders were forced to contemplate the possibility of defeat. Emperor Hirohito, in his private councils, began to express doubts about the war's direction. The man who had sanctioned the attack on Pearl Harbor now worried that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant that could not be defeated. His questions about the war's progress became more pointed, forcing his military advisors to confront uncomfortable truths about Japanese capabilities. The industrial statistics told a grim story. Japan's shipyards, operating at maximum capacity, could not replace the lost carriers for at least 2 years. American shipyards, meanwhile, were just beginning to demonstrate their productive capacity. The Essex-class carriers under construction would soon tip the balance permanently in America's favor. But perhaps most critically, the aura of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. Throughout the Pacific, Allied forces that had been retreating for 6 months began to sense that the tide was turning. The Japanese, who had seemed unstoppable, were suddenly vulnerable. The crack in the empire had appeared, and it would only grow wider as the war progressed. The humid air of Guadalcanal hung heavy with the scent of tropical vegetation and impending doom as Japanese forces prepared for what would become their first major land defeat of the war. The disaster at Midway had created a cascade of consequences that now threatened to unravel Japan's entire strategic position in the South Pacific. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the 8th Fleet from his base at Rabaul, found himself in an impossible position. The promised carrier support that was supposed to dominate the Solomon Islands had vanished in the flames off Midway. His surface fleet, powerful as it was, could not provide the sustained air cover necessary for major amphibious operations. The American response was swift and decisive. On August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. The operation, which might have been impossible with Japanese carriers controlling the approaches, proceeded with minimal opposition. The strategic initiative had clearly passed to the Americans. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marine Landing Force, understood that he was witnessing the beginning of the American offensive that would eventually reach Tokyo Bay. The Japanese, who had seemed unstoppable just months before, were now fighting to hold positions they had previously taken with ease. The Battle of Savo Island on August 9 demonstrated that Japanese surface forces could still inflict heavy casualties on American ships. Admiral Mikawa's night attack sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in one of the most lopsided naval victories of the war. But tactical success could not mask the strategic reality. Without carrier-based air power, such victories were temporary at best. The loss of the experienced Japanese pilots at Midway created a domino effect that extended far beyond the immediate battle. The pilots assigned to support operations in the Solomons were green replacements, lacking the skills and experience of their predecessors. American pilots, meanwhile, were gaining experience and confidence with each engagement. Captain Reizo Tanaka, commanding the Tokyo Express destroyer runs to Guadalcanal, performed miracles of seamanship and courage in keeping Japanese forces supplied. But his destroyers, no matter how skillfully handled, could not replace the strategic mobility that carrier aviation had provided. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th revealed the full extent of Japanese naval aviation's decline. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, still in command despite the Midway disaster, led a reduced carrier force against the Americans. The engagement cost Japan the light carrier Ryuyo and dozens more irreplaceable pilots. While American losses were quickly replaced, the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental weakness in Japanese strategy. The empire had been designed for swift, decisive victories that would force enemy nations to negotiate. The prolonged battle for Henderson Field, with its daily losses of aircraft and pilots, was exactly the kind of war Japan could not win. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, leading Marine Fighter Squadron 212, represented the new generation of American aviators who were learning to exploit Japanese weaknesses. The Marines, flying from the crude airstrip on Guadalcanal, gradually gained air superiority over the island through superior numbers and improving tactics. The industrial implications of the prolonged campaign were devastating for Japan. Every aircraft lost over Guadalcanal represented resources that could not be replaced. American factories, meanwhile, were reaching full production capacity. The mathematical certainty of defeat was becoming apparent to those Japanese leaders willing to face reality. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, watching his carefully husbanded carrier forces being ground down in the Solomons, began to understand that the war was already lost. The Battle of Midway had not just cost Japan for carriers, it had cost them the ability to dictate the terms of engagement throughout the Pacific. The human cost was equally devastating. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, cut off from regular supply and reinforcement, began to starve. The island they had renamed Starvation Island became a symbol of Japanese overextension and strategic failure. By February 9, 1943, the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal was complete. The operation, skillfully executed by the Navy, saved thousands of lives, but could not hide the strategic reality. Japan was in retreat. The avalanche that had begun at Midway was gathering momentum, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. The Pacific War had entered a new phase, one where American industrial might and growing tactical skill would gradually overwhelm Japanese forces across the vast ocean. The empire that had seemed invincible was now fighting desperately to maintain positions it had once taken for granted. The final chapter of Japan's naval decline began in the crystal-clear waters of the Philippine Sea. On June 19, 1944, 2 years after Midway, the remaining elements of the Japanese combined fleet prepared for what Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa called the decisive battle that would determine the fate of the empire. The contrast with the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor was stark and devastating. Where once veteran pilots had flown from the decks of 6 fleet carriers, now inexperienced aviators launched from a motley collection of ships, hastily converted to carrier duty. The institutional knowledge that had made Japanese naval aviation so deadly had died in the flames off Midway, and no amount of desperate training could replace it. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 58, understood that he was witnessing the death throes of Japanese naval power. The massive American fleet, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, and 91 other vessels represented the industrial might that Japan could never match. The Essex-class carriers, built in American shipyards with assembly line efficiency, had tipped the balance permanently in America's favor. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted. Japanese pilots, some with as little as 6 months of training, flew against American aviators with years of combat experience. The results were predictable and devastating. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single day. His achievement, while remarkable, was representative of the wider slaughter taking place across the Philippine Sea. Of the 400 Japanese aircraft launched that day, only 130 returned to their carriers. The loss of the carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, the former Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, completed the destruction of Japanese naval aviation that had begun at Midway. Admiral Ozawa, forced to transfer his flag to a destroyer after the Taiho exploded, watched helplessly as his remaining carriers fled westward with empty flight decks. The strategic implications were immediate and final. Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations anywhere in the Pacific had been permanently destroyed. The remaining carriers, lacking experienced pilots and adequate aircraft, were essentially useless as offensive weapons. The empire was now limited to defensive operations, trying desperately to hold what it had already conquered. But the psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the material losses. The Japanese military, which had staked everything on the concept of spiritual superiority and fighting spirit, now faced the undeniable reality of American technological and industrial supremacy. The pilots who had survived the day's slaughter returned to their carriers with stories of overwhelming American numbers and firepower. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the defeat in his palace, finally began to understand the full implications of the war he had sanctioned. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan from foreign invaders had failed to materialize. Instead, the Americans were approaching the homeland with unprecedented force and determination. The final act of the combined fleet's destruction came from months later at the Battle of Light Gulf. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, lacking air cover due to the destruction of Japanese naval aviation, fought bravely but futilely against overwhelming American firepower. The battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamamoto's flagship, sank under repeated air attacks, symbolizing the triumph of aviation over traditional naval power. The kamikaze attacks that began during the Philippines campaign represented the ultimate admission of Japanese defeat. When a nation's military resorts to suicide attacks, it acknowledges that conventional victory is impossible. The divine wind that Japanese propagandists promised would destroy the American fleet was revealed as the desperate last resort of a broken empire. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, understood that the war in the Pacific was effectively over. The Japanese fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, was now incapable of meaningful offensive operations. The long advance toward Tokyo could proceed without fear of significant naval opposition. The circle that had begun at Pearl Harbor was now complete. The Japanese attack that had seemed to secure their dominance in the Pacific had instead awakened an industrial giant that would not rest until the rising sun flag was lowered over the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The catastrophic defeat at Midway had not just cost Japan for carriers, it had cost them the war itself. The inability to regroup after that devastating loss had created a cascade of defeats that culminated in the complete destruction of Japanese naval power and the empire's unconditional surrender. The Pacific, which had once seemed like a Japanese lake, had become an American ocean. The sun that had risen on the Japanese empire now set on its ashes, a testament to the decisive nature of that fateful day off Midway, when the course of history changed forever.